we've created this like mythos about engineering time and flow, but too often companies move to the other end of that pendulum and it becomes, we don't bother the engineers. We can't possibly bother the engineers, right? They have to work. And I am a huge believer that engineers are a massive contributor to value driving. They know the most about the products you're trying to build. They're responsible for the execution. If you give those folks insight into what are our business goals, how do we achieve success, and they're involved in very early and often in that product development process, they have an outsized influence in being able to accelerate product development.
Welcome to Tech Teams Today. I'm Lucas Mendes. I'm the CEO of Revelo, and it's great to have you here. Today, we're joined by Joshua Krohn, SVP of Engineering at Flash Parking. Flash Parking, it's a pioneering technology company that brings seamless parking and EV charging experiences to drivers. Its platform connects reservable parking and charging in the apps drivers use every day with garage, surface lot, event, and valid parking locations. Josh, welcome to the show. We'd like to start by having our guests sort of walk us through their journey. And you had an impressive career. You started out as a developer and then leading engineering teams across multiple companies, including Arrive and now Flash.
Yeah, so it's I consider myself pretty fortunate. I started off in mechanical engineering. I love math, I love physics. I was like, wow, mechanical engineering, it's going to be great, right? And very quickly realized, oh, you don't actually do a lot of fun things. It's just equations. At this point, I'd done a lot of stuff with computers. I'd taken a C++ course in high school. You take C as a part of the intro engineering curriculum at that point. I was like, I kind of like this programming thing. And so doubled down and just pivoted from there, right? And you then graduate and like, what do you do? Where do I look? Then I actually started doing infrastructure. So systems, point of sale, telephony, network infrastructure, things like that. And just kind of stumbled into opportunities. So it's working 4 12-hour days and 3 days off. And there was a small company that was doing commodities metal pricing that was looking for someone to do some job. It's like, well, I've got nothing but time on my hands. So I started working with them part-time, eventually moved in full-time. And that was looking back 2006, like a fully remote role for a small company. And at that point, 8 people, 3 people doing development, just pulling price data from Reuters. And we were naive enough to say, hey, we should move to real-time price distribution. No more of this XML pull feed. Not really recognizing how hard of a problem that was. And so we went and built data feeds, right? So all of the London Metal Exchange, Shanghai Future Exchange, COMEX, NYMEX data at full trade depth, which is an incredible amount of data. And you run into all sorts of just scale problems of, we have 2 binaries talking to each other over named pipes. Well, we've exhausted the bandwidth of named pipes. What do we do now? Right? And you find things like London will just say, aluminum was 1 cent a ton. It was clearly not 1 cent a ton, right? So you're rapidly building all these price controls and real-time alerting and like getting into like hard problems at scale. And we're just a tiny company. And then it got to the point where we became the 3rd largest distributor of LME data in the world behind Reuters and Bloomberg. And then our company of 11 people, right? So it was fun. It was interesting. You got to really just explore the problem space. Now it's high pressure. It's 24/7 trading, 365. I'm sure my wife didn't love getting woken up at night when feeds went down, but like it creates an environment where you have to go learn and you have to go do. And I had the ability and an opportunity to go do that.
I absolutely love those stories. During my 10-year anniversary celebration with my wife, we had a saying that went, we did this not because it was easy, but because we thought it was easy. Sounds very much like your journey.
Yeah, no, it's a huge, like you're like, how hard can this be? Right? Until you run into the issues and you're like, oh no, we're knee deep in it now. We have to solve it rapidly. So it's just been while I was doing that, I had a Bluetooth in my car and if it didn't connect, it took like 5 minutes to connect, and like it frustrated me to no end. And so at that point, NFC was new. I'd got my Nexus S. It was the first Android phone with NFC, and I was like, "Wow, this is a little detection thing. Like maybe I can just use this to turn on Bluetooth when I get in my car." And that quickly became a little pet project. I'm like, can I write data to this? It's just a little storage mechanism. I posted on some developer forums. I was, well, let me write a little DSL so it starts to do other things, right? But you're very limited in space, so it has to be constrained. So I made this, and like, I'll publish it in Google's developer store. Maybe I'll make my $25, right? And it was super successful. Shockingly successful that it's kind of like a second job that I started to have at night, doing support and answering emails. Eventually I sold that to a company out in San Francisco of guys who were working in the same space. And they were like, hey, you can stay outside of Chicago. We just want to look at cool stuff. Like, can you figure out where someone is and what they're doing? And so, again, just like open questions where I started to drive around in my car and pull little snippets of sound and, like, can I analyze this and figure out, am I in a car? Am I driving? Windows up, windows down, radio on, radio off. What's the engine noise signature, right? Things that just, I didn't know, is this a hard or an easy problem? But we had the opportunity to go kind of chase it. Right? So I got to spend a couple of years dynamically figuring out with bits of data, like hybrid GPS, Wi-Fi signals, Bluetooth signals, gyro data, sound data. Like, how do we build iterative systems that figure out where are you and what are you doing and with what degree of confidence, and then give you that data and use it to automate things, simplify your life, share it with your spouse, right? All those kind of signals. Again, I look back now and it's like, this is silly. I got the opportunity to do this, but it was just exploratory and interesting and fun, and kind of pushing on the edge of technology at the time, for what we were trying to do. And that all kind of drove me into my current role, where I stepped into a company of, I was employee 22 at Parkwiz, which then became Arrive. I came in and was like, lead mobile app development, do some things, and immediately was like, oh, you have this giant monolith that is incredibly inefficient, and these schemas don't make sense. These APIs don't make sense. About 3 weeks in, I went to our VP of engineering at the time, and I was like, listen, I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I can help you fix all of these things. And to his credit, he was great. He said, you won't step on any toes. Please help. And my reward for that was I then got to do 2 jobs for the next 6 months until we found another mobile developer. But that really kicked off go formally lead these teams and start to lead these employees. And we started to invest in hiring and growth and building teams and understanding, like, how do we scale systems, right? So we started working with Ticketmaster in 2014. And if you've ever bought tickets from Ticketmaster, when they tried to do a large on sale, pre-virtual waiting room, Ticketmaster couldn't handle Ticketmaster's load. What are we supposed to do, right? Like, we can't afford anywhere near the servers Ticketmaster has. So I had to start to get really creative with technical solutions. So, how do we build appropriate caching layers and isolate core infrastructure? What does that look like from a technology and architecture side? So I do consider myself fortunate where I've got to jump into a lot of challenging problems and interesting problem spaces just as a consequence of business, right?
I wanted to double click on that step of your career. How has Flash evolved since the merger with Arrive, right? Because that transaction really must have changed how you work and how your teams work. And any learnings from that experience?
Yes, it's been really interesting. So when pre-Flash, we had acquired 2 companies in Israel, and the first one was rough. We learned some lessons, and the second one went better because we applied some of those lessons that we learned. Post merger with Flash, now you've got this coming together of teams and coming together of cultures, and then we bought 6 more companies, and the integration of teams and technologies is really hard. Right? People get very emotionally attached to what they built and what their value is to the company. A lot of what you take for granted from like a culture and relationship standpoint isn't there, and you've got to go build it ground up. start to build those relationships, build that trust with individuals, but then also across teams, which are geographically dispersed, right? Like we've got folks in the US, Latin America, Romania, Israel, and so they're on different time zones and they're not used to working with each other. And now they've got to trust that this guy's working in their best interest as well. And so it's when pre-Flash, like we had slowly kind of built a good nucleus of engineers, really focused on hiring, focused on development of people and that culture. And then when you rapidly scale that with more people, how do you transplant that? Like, how do you start to build that across teams and instill those things into those leaders? It's challenging, right? And then get them all aligned on a long-term technology vision and how their pieces fit into it. Maybe not all the pieces. Maybe we're going to carve some of these things away, but these core pieces are going to drive our platform of the future. It was a lot of the softer problems, right? Getting alignment, driving alignment, getting people to trust each other. And we some of the things we still work through today as we continue to break down some of those walls and bring people together.
You spoke a little bit about managing distributed teams. I'd love for you to share some of the biggest lessons you've learned about leading engineering at a global scale.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I found is important is culture and communication matters incredible amount. Like you always think about the technical side of it. Like how do we define technical interfaces? How do these systems work together? That's probably one of the easiest parts, right? And I go back to that ridiculous frog insurance commercial. You guys like frog insurance? Like they think they're saying the same thing. And very often teams talk past each other and they truly believe they're saying the same thing and they're coming from the same space, but culturally they're acting from a different mindset. They define success differently, right? They value different things, or they're not being clear or explicit enough in their communication. And it's like, we really had to circle back on how do we be explicit about our first principles? How do we set clear expectations of how should we work together and how do we drive toward common ground so that both our leaders and our individual engineers on teams, I'm a big fan of it. Hey, engineer, just talk to engineer, right? But all of those folks are working together, pulling in the same direction, communicating effectively.
You spoke about culture, and I think culture is a big driver of what makes a team great in engineering. What else? What else do you think separates a great engineering team from one that is good but just okay?
Because there's kind of like three big principles that I anchor against for teams. I think it is imperative that teams have ownership and they understand how their contributions matter. To me, the worst thing you're going to have is a bunch of engineers who show up and don't care. They don't care if a system goes down. They don't care if there's bugs. They don't care what happens. And the only way they care is if they have autonomy and they have ownership and they understand how what they're doing contributes to the success of the business. It's like that's been a core principle for us as we seek to decompose teams as they grow so they don't get too large, but also that they maintain that ownership and they understand that value, right? Going with that, like roles and expectations have to be clear. Like it's so important to me that when people show up, they know what's my job? What is the expectation of me? How do I make sure that I'm performing at a high level? How do I go from A to B, grow my career? And how do I know what everyone else around me is supposed to do and trust them to do it? If you don't trust your team to execute on their side, like it becomes this never ending, like, yeah, why should I put in the extra time? That guy's not going to get his stuff done, right? And the last part of that, performance management, is super important. Like we have both on the interviewing and performance management side, like I long anchor toward like keep the bar high as long as possible. Eventually, if you have 10,000 engineers, like there's some natural like descending, right? But we're not that large of an org. If you've got 50, 100, 150 engineers, like smallish teams, how do you keep that bar high? How do you build a culture of performance and make sure that you're having those conversations when people aren't rising to the level they need to, so that people trust each other and they work effectively together within their team and across teams? I think if you do all those things, like you end up just kind of naturally building a strong nucleus of people who are investing in the right things and hold each other accountable.
Just a follow-up question on that. You spoke about ownership and really showing up and caring about, the outcome. How do you screen for that? How do you, during the interviewing process, how do you look for that?
Yeah. So it's a hard one to screen for. And then honestly, this is why I strongly bias toward when we look for putting people in leadership positions, we look internal. I've found it hard to effectively interview for that. And in a way that you're like, yes, like we are 100% confident this is the right person. I think naturally, if you bring in engineers who are strong, you invest in growing their careers, they have ownership and autonomy over the systems that they have. And then you elevate those folks into leadership positions, supporting them, guiding them through that transition, right? Like their team sees that. People see that in the org. Like everyone kind of lifts with that, both functionally and then from a sentiment standpoint. I was like, that's largely been our strategy. At some point, potentially we'll have to shift external and try, external hires again. But I always try to, if we can, bias toward that internal hire because we've seen those people. We've seen them in action. We know their personality. We know how they interact with their teams. And so we feel good about being able to, bring those people up to that next level and help them build some of the skills they need to lead teams.
Yeah, I love that approach. I actually had a professor at Stanford called Huggy Rao, and he taught a class called Scaling Up Excellence, where he said, it's simple. You basically reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. And doing internal promotions and choosing the leaders from within is basically doing that, right? So you're finding the good behavior and you're rewarding that, and you're creating these beacons that other people can look at. I think it's a great take. Let's talk a little bit about engineering talent. You've been in a leadership position for over a decade now. What differences have you seen in talent today in more recent vintages, so to speak, versus say it's 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We starting in 2014, like we've been very thoughtful about how do we hire? What are the characteristics we look for? Like, what do we think make people successful in these roles? And I'm a huge believer. Anyone can learn languages. Anyone can learn syntaxes and patterns. It's very hard to learn problem solving. It's very hard to learn how do you decompose a large solution into components mentally, and then understand the cascading impacts of changes. And so, as we think about hiring and interviewing, it's highly focused on how do you define the problem space? How do you break the problem down into solvable components? Like iteratively kind of working with the candidate through that process. And so that, I think over time, like those skills kind of remain. People have them, they don't. It's like if it works. I think one of the things that there's kind of two things that have been an interesting shift. One that we've had to kind of change our focus on, and one that's just generally affected our candidate pool. So we're seeing a lot more broad and less deep experience. People changing jobs incredibly frequently and not always getting kind of the ability to meaningfully contribute to things. And like when I think back on my career, like I was very lucky that I got to go deep on hard problems. Like that makes you go develop skill sets that you might not get. And those opportunities aren't at every company and in every position. Like there's a function of kind of time and opportunity there. But if you're not working with the product for 2, 3, 4 years, you don't feel the pain of bad choices you made in the past. You don't really understand, hey, if I don't make a thoughtful action now, I'm going to pay for that later. And so like we are seeing candidates where every 12 to 18 months they're in a new role. And that's not everyone. Like we still do get folks that, they're in roles 2, 3, 4 years getting that deep experience, but there's a lot more job hopping. And so as we think about, especially for more senior roles, like where we want to empower those people to, like they have to be the ones to call out those risks and call out the need to do those things. We've got to look for that experience and really understand in those roles, like dive deep on what did you do? What were your contributions? Not your team. What did you do? I think the other thing is the move to fully remote is one that is not without challenges. So we had been working partially remote since 2014. with COVID, we just went fully remote and started hiring all over. Um, the failure rate of folks earlier in their career is much higher. What I'm seeing is they don't reach out. Like their inertia to reach out to someone and ask for help or ask an opinion is so much higher than if they were sitting next to a peer in the office. And so as we think about bringing people on, like there is a bigger focus on just that overall communication. Do they take initiative and proactively reach out? How are they at communicating? Because we understand that if they don't, their likelihood of not continuing to grow just goes up exponentially in a remote world.
Yeah, and we see other engineering leaders echo that concern as well. Not by chance, the majority of the demand we get at Revelo for remote talent is actually people who have done things before. So entry level talent and junior people, there's more of an uncertainty around that. So yeah, I can totally see your opinion resonating with a lot of your peers. Joshua, I wanted to shift gears here a little bit and talk about technology and the future of technology. So Flash is doing some cool stuff with access control hardware and digital parking solutions, even computer vision. Can you share a little bit about how AI and automation are shaping the future of that industry?
Yeah, so it's been for us interesting. So the vision space is one that has been relatively stagnant. I'll say stagnant, but not like a derogatory way. Like you have cameras, they have a relative degree of accuracy, 95% or so. Some will, you'll get claims of like 99% of applicable reads, but they require very fixed positioning, right? So they have to be a certain distance back and within a pretty tight tolerance of angles in order to get good reads, and then use OCR extraction and things to get plate data. We work in a lot of urban cores, and the reality is there's just not good places to put cameras a lot of the time. And there's a strong desire that if I already have a camera on site and it's reading license plates, could I also use it to help facilitate operations and look for paid versus unpaid stalls, for example, or track a vehicle through a garage to understand, like, did it enter a restricted zone, right, reserved for rental cars or things versus park in a regular spot, and let parking operators know. So we started looking at cameras several years ago and started making that investment. And our ability to build ML models and start to use AI to look at these images differently has allowed us to do some pretty extreme things. So one, we can extract a lot more data, make and model of the car. Is it an ICE vehicle? Is it an electric vehicle? Do a lot more tracking of the vehicle, but then also things like damage detection. Did someone come up and break the barrier, which happens shockingly often? Are they trying to, right? And things like, instead of having to have a 40-degree angle at 12 feet away, we can mount a camera 3 feet away at a 75-degree angle, potentially. And the training of those models used AI to generate 500,000, a million images, and then feed back into the model and use supervised learning to start to train that. And then we use that model for edge compute, right? So we're not sending that up to the cloud. Traditionally, these providers take this image, they broadcast it to the cloud, you do your processing in the cloud, and then data gets spit out. And so we were able to bring all of that down to the edge. So you get faster, more accurate processing, which then allows us to take that data and do much more on the technology front. So camera parking is much bigger in Europe, right? You drive in, your license plate is registered with a large partner like Easy Park, gate goes up, you drive in, you drive out, automatically pay. License plates in Europe are easy. License plates in the United States are the Wild West, right? There's a million different formats. People have license plates covers. So your accuracy rates go down. So we looked at how do we leverage ML and AI in this space to start to bring this product to market in a meaningful way that's useful for customers and elevates their experience and simplifies it and doesn't just leave them stranded at a gate, pushing a call button, trying to get out. It's like we've been making that investment. Like, we feel really good about the results. We started deploying the cameras earlier this year. We're starting to deploy that kind of camera parking experience, which is this automatic end-to-end flow, that allows users in and out easily. Theory, increase throughput. You don't wait as long in the garage. Like everyone wins in that scenario, but it has to work well.
It's great. How about internal workflows being changed by AI? How about AI adoption within your engineering team, for example? How is that having an impact on your team, but also on the way you lead the team?
So we're in proof of concept mode with a lot of things, right? So our support and ops team they've integrated LLMs very, very well to support customers and direct them to help articles. Like that's a pretty well-worn path at this point. We're looking at this from kind of 4 perspectives. So there's code generation, unit test generation, explanation and discovery, right? So kind of free chat. What does this code do? And then technical documentation generation, right? And so we're looking at a number of
AI adoption there, right? So it's a whole eternity of AI adoption: test coverage, documentation, and explanation and code-based understanding.
Yeah, and then this is one of the areas where if you look 6-8 months ago versus today, and 6-8 months before that, like the leaps have grown substantially. And so the context window is so important. And we've been working with Gemini a bit, primarily because of the 2 million token context window. So we can feed a code base in and then ask exploratory questions, generate technical documentation, which is pretty good at the documentation side. But then how do we use that then to facilitate discovery for developers? We're stepping into a new code base or onto a team. We want to understand what are the middlewares in this application and how do they work? Where does a certain action occur? Historically, you rely on application structure and project structure and comments, and they've got to kind of work their way through. And so, we're looking at these initiatives. We're trying it with 3 teams at the moment of, how can we accelerate developer learning and adoption? And how do we make your job a little bit easier so that instead of going to Google and asking a question, you can go right in your IDE, and it's actually giving you a solution that knows about your local code and is relevant to the thing you're working on. It's early days as far as kind of getting that in place and understanding the actual kind of metric-driven impact. But I'm optimistic. There's areas that unit test generation is shockingly good at least getting the scaffolding in place. If you can do the 50% lifting, accelerate the last 50%, awesome, right? It's just kind of a net value add. How do we spend a little bit less time doing some of those rote things? That to me is where we're going to see the biggest gains now. 6-8 months from now, who knows, right? We continue to see pretty massive leaps there.
Yeah. And with AI changing so fast, what do you say to young people who are considering a career in software development today? How should they position themselves to stay relevant and really thriving in a space that's changing so fast?
Yeah. So I'm a skeptic in the AI will replace software engineers long term. And I view it as a tool. So I always tell people lean in, right? If we go through the last 20 years, the introductions of tools into the development space that didn't exist before, right? You used to need DBAs all over. You've got automated database profiling tools, application profiling tools, you've got code completion and IntelliSense in your IDE, right? All sorts of things that didn't exist before that became tools that allowed developers to be more effective and more productive. I look at Gen AI as a similar set of tooling. And so I think understanding how can you leverage this as you start in your career, as you grow in your career, how do you engineer prompts? How do you use these tools effectively to help you in your day-to-day workload? What we find today is sometimes it's right, sometimes it is terribly wrong. It doesn't understand the business context, and it doesn't understand all of the constraints all the time. And so I tend to view person plus Gen I as kind of that inference plus computation model, right? Where you're part of the system, use it as a tool to help you and understand how do you use it effectively? What's it good at? What is it not good at? And then try it, play with it, push it. When models update, try new things again, because some things it used to be bad at, it might get better at. But try to integrate that into your workflows and really explore and kind of push those boundaries, because it might be much better in 6 months than it was 6 months ago.
And I think people get better as well at dealing with these models as they gain experience dealing with them in different spheres of life, right? So I have a friend who jokes that, sometimes you need to establish a prompt that is so clear and so well structured that you just rather do that through a programming language, right? Nothing is as clear and as objective as that. But people will eventually catch up. And I think my opinion is that, prompting will be a part of life, basically.
Crafting the prompt is so key. We had an on-site, we had all our developers, multiple teams. We had a bunch of courses we were going to try to run through, and I had them express their interest in what courses might you be interested in. So now I have a CSV of CSV lists that I have to break down and figure out, how do I schedule this so most people can attend the most things that I could have tried to sit down and write a bunch of code to do this. I gave it to Gemini. Like, I have this CSV, here's the contents, break this down and print every course overlapped with every other course ordered by the minimum number of overlap people. And it just spits it all out. Then I had to write another script to validate that list against the previous one. It made this scheduling take 20 minutes. It would have probably taken me several hours to work through this on my own. And it's like, but the prompt matters. What is it? What am I trying to get out? What is your output? But done properly, like, it can be an accelerator in some instances, or you can have to be so deep in the weeds with specifics that, like, I could have written by now,
We spoke about your advice to people who are considering a career in engineering. How about those that are listening to us right now and are actually aspiring engineering leaders, right? Those people that today might be ICs and want to get into a management position. What would you say to them when it comes to adapting to changes that are being brought by AI and new technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in, like, opportunity is the intersection of, like, your willingness, the opportunity for a thing to happen, and, like, your ability to execute against that thing. And so if I pulled folks in our organization, that's like, if you sit with your hand out, like, please offer me an opportunity, like, something might come, something might never come. And so to me, it's important, like, how do you find those opportunities? How do you seek them out and put yourself in a position to offer more value, demonstrate more value? Like, how are you expressing your desire to have a bigger role within the organization, whether it's an individual or leadership role, right? Like, make sure that's clear, and then look for opportunities to do that, even informally, right? We use projects and things as a way to start to tee people up to get into those leadership positions. Stand them up with a few people, drive this end to end, work with the planning, plan the delivery, manage delivery. But someone has to be willing to do that. And I am surprised at the number of times that, historically over the last decade, we floated the idea to people. And there's a lot of people who are like, not interested, right? And like, okay, that's fine, right? Like, there's a path here as well on the IC side. But if you're looking for more leadership opportunities, like, I'm a big believer in, like, seek them out. Look at the tools you have at your disposal. Look at the opportunities and the problems that your teams are facing, your company's facing, and come to the table with, I think I can help. Right? Here's how I think I can help. Can we work together to make this happen? And we go back to kind of, how do you identify leaders? Like, those are the types of characteristics that we've looked for historically, internally, and as we interview, right? Do you seek out opportunities to make improvements, and do you bring them forward and push for them? Are you the driver of change, or are you just kind of sitting back and waiting?
It's a great take. I wanted to put you on the spot with a final question. Is there an opinion that you have about engineering leadership that sort of goes against the grain of conventional wisdom, like something you believe that others might disagree with?
Oh, I'm sure there is. So I think in general, engineers are way too protected. Like, we've created this, like, mythos about engineering time and flow, and but yeah, okay, flow's a thing, right? You got to model a system in your head and understand it. But too often, companies move to the other end of that pendulum, and it becomes, we don't bother the engineers. We can't possibly bother the engineers, right? They have to work. And I am a huge believer that engineers are a massive contributor to value driving. They know most about the products you're trying to build. They're responsible for the execution. If you give those folks insight into what are our business goals, how do we achieve success? And they're involved in very early and often in that product development process. They have an outsized influence in being able to accelerate product development and pass the success, and then bring things to the table of, hey, notice this is a problem. We could just change these things and have X effect. But too often as companies kind of mature, right? And they get past that 10, 20 people, they're starting to bring in product managers. We got a little bit of a product team. Like these silos go up and, oh, we're looking at sprint velocity. We've got to protect the engineers at all costs. I think companies are losing out by not having better engagement. And it can't go the other way. It can't be death by a million cuts, but there is a middle ground where you can leverage that knowledge and that experience way more effectively. That's an internal thing that we try to do as well. Like, how do we get at least our leads involved in this process super, super early so that we don't end up with, product had an idea, design spent 3 weeks making mocks, we get it to engineering and they go, we can't do any of this. Now everyone is unhappy about the process and the result, right? So yeah, that would be my, I think there's way too much coddling and protection. These are smart, mature individuals. Like, be honest with them and keep them engaged.
That's a great take. I really, really like that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joshua. Guys, we were just joined by Joshua Krohn, SVP of Engineering at Flash Parking. It was a great conversation. Hope you guys enjoyed that as well. Josh, how can people stay in touch with you? X, LinkedIn, what's your preferred mode of contact?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably best. Not a huge social media guy, but I am super passionate about engineering, hiring, careers. Like, I'd love to talk about folks. So if anybody wants to connect and chat, more than happy to, meet up, answer questions. It's a worthwhile exercise.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Tech Teams Today podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in.